So lack of conscience or empathy. You know that little voice in your head that tells you to return a found wallet or that others, or to do unto others as you want them to do unto you? Your conscience. Psychopaths tend to not have a conscience the same way that other people do, and they certainly don't have empathy. And it's interesting. She goes on. Well, people high in psychopathy don't think that voice. Don't have that voice. Sorry. Or if they do, its volume is turned down very low. As a result, they lack many of the social emotions that normal people take for granted. And it's an important point there. She uses that word normal people. Psychopaths are normal in the sense that they exist. They're not like a deformity of some kind. You could call it a condition, you could call it a personality type, or whatever you want to call it. But they're natural. She doesn't mention it here within the text, but we seem to understand that psychopathy is genetic and that it seems to be triggered by some type of early childhood trauma. Now, what that trauma is pretty broad. I believe we were talking last time about Dexter here. It came up, the TV show Dexter. It's about a guy who's a psychopath, and he's a murderer, he's a serial killer. And the idea is that when he was a little boy, he was being raised by his mom, and his mom was an informant for the police department. Some people found out about that, and they murdered her. They just cut her up with a chainsaw while she was alive, and they did it in front of Dexter when he was 3 years old. So he's kind of suppressed that memory from his mind. But the police officer who came in and found him sitting in his mom's own blood, carried him out and adopted him because he didn't have anybody else. Just felt something for that kid and adopted him. As Dexter was growing up, he started to the police officer started to notice that there were these traits within the kid. He was killing animals. He seemed to be fascinated by blood and all that. So he realized this kid's damaged. He's probably going to be a serial killer. So rather than try to suppress that impulse, rather than trying to suppress that shadow part of him, he directed him into serial killing, but to kill the right people. And so because he was a police officer, he trained him on how to get away with it. Dexter goes into blood spatter analysis, so he knows how crime scenes, how to cover up crime scenes. And he goes off and he's a serial killer who kills other serial killers mostly. Yeah, so it's an interesting premise. And essentially they're serial killers, as the show begins, they're serial killers who have gotten away with it. In other words, they've been arrested for murder, and they got off on a technicality. Or they were arrested for murder, but then the witnesses were intimidated into not testifying. So he goes after people like that initially. But in that case there, what triggered it was, watching his mom murdered when he was 3 years old. Yeah.
What is this called?
Dexter. You can see it on Netflix.
Yeah.
Now.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah. Now there's another case of a kid from Canada, and God, I was trying to remember his name earlier. I was talking to the previous period. I said I would try to get his name. I can't remember. I forgot to look it up. But in short, when he was 15 years old, he murdered somebody. He was the first, as I understand it, the first minor in Canadian history to be identified as a psychopath. And there's a unique documentary called In the Shadow of Feeling, and it's about him. It's about psychopathy, but he's the one that they're kind of focused on. And essentially, this kid, when he was, I think it was like 5 years old, his parents divorced. So he went to go live with his mom. His mom was very strict. He didn't like that. His dad was contemptful towards mom, and so dad was the cool parent who let him do whatever he wanted to do, and then also badmouthed mom. So the kid grew up kind of hearing these things. So of course, that being the case, the kid's going to kind of like his dad more. Well, it turns out the kid is a psychopath, which means he was narcissistic, he didn't have conscience or empathy, he was Machiavellian. So all those things together, of course, made him resent his mom and hate his mom. So he wanted to stop living with his mom. He ran away from home, stayed with his dad. They caught him over there, sent him back. So he decided, I want to get away from my mom for a long time. So what's the reasonable thing to do when you want to get away from your house for a while? Murder a classmate, right? Because then you go to prison for a long time and you don't have to go home and live with mom. It makes sense, right? Please say no. Because if you're sitting going, let me know, I can transfer you to a different class. I know just the people. This is his thought process, because complete lack of empathy, he doesn't see people as people. He sees people as objects in the world that are just there to be manipulated and moved around for his own benefit. So one day during what would be their nutrition break, he murdered a classmate. There was like this little wooded area where the students would sit. He just murdered him. He told somebody else he was doing it. He murdered the person, covered him with leaves, and then went back to class. And then when he was arrested, and his whole reasoning for it was, I just didn't want to live with my mom for a while. If I just stole a car, I'd go to jail for like 6 months, and then they'd let me out, and I'd have to go back to live with my mom. He said, but I figured I wanted to go away for a long time, so I murdered a classmate. And it wasn't someone who he hated. It wasn't someone he had animosity towards. He just decided that he needed to get away from mom. That's a lack of empathy, a lack of conscience.
That sounds scary.
Yeah. And the creepy part is that we find out that it's impossible to treat a psychopath because once that thing's been triggered, it's been triggered. All you can do is tell a psychopath, here's what you are. And if you act on these things, you're going to get in trouble. You're going to go to jail. Your life is going to be difficult. So you help a psychopath understand what they are, and then give them the tools to not engage in those destructive behaviors. But you can't change it. And that's what's creepy, is at the end of the video, this kid's talking, and he's in silhouette, by the way. And he's giving all of the right answers. He's saying, when I first got here, and so-and-so was treating me, I was really pissed off at him, because he was telling me I was this, I was that. But as time went on, and I started thinking about it more, it's like, yeah, it made more sense to me, and it occurred to me that this kid who he killed was a real person, and I remember seeing his grandmother talk about him in court, and it really started to affect me. Every single word out of this kid's mouth is a lie. Every single word out of his mouth is manipulation because he wants to be released from prison. Exactly. And so what has happened is that psychopaths will learn, here's how I'm supposed to talk. Here's what I'm supposed to feel, so let me imitate the feeling I'm supposed to have. That's why the documentary is called In the Shadow of Feeling. Yeah.
So it also shows selfishness, basically. Like they didn't really care about who they killed or.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But it only benefited them.
Yeah. And that's that lack of empathy. There's an intense selfishness. Right? Questions about that one?
He was the youngest.
If I recall correctly, he's the youngest person in Canadian history to be diagnosed as a psychopath.
What's his name?
But that's just because they didn't diagnose kids. They didn't, minors. They didn't diagnose minors.
What's his name?
I'll get it for you before you leave. I can even show you a picture of him before you leave.
Oh, just kidding.
Yeah. Won't surprise you. Others? All right, take a look at the next one.